Hey guys, good morning or afternoon or evening, whatever it is for you. I'm here today to talk to you about your revision for your complete story narrative. And hopefully after watching this screencast, you'll just have an idea of what you can do to make your complete story narrative the best it can be. I love this quote by E.L. Doctorow. He says that good writing is supposed to evoke sensation in the reader, not the fact that it is raining, but the feeling of being rained upon. So that's something you can think about as you revise your narrative. Are you evoking feelings? Are you showing your reader what it's like to be in your moment, or are you just telling them? And of course, you want to show your reader what it's like to be in your moment. So we're going to talk about 5 areas of revision. We'll talk about your introduction. We'll talk about narrative versus expository writing. We'll talk about transitioning between the narrative and expository genre. We'll talk about showing, not telling. And we'll talk about dialogue formatting. So the first thing we're going to talk about is your introduction to your single story or complete story. Just remember that you don't have to have a formal introduction to explain the single story when there might be a more creative way to convey your message. So for example, if you look at this excerpt here, it says, "Nerd. Why doesn't he hate school like everyone else? He's such a try-hard. These are the voices of many throughout my life that form my social identity behind my back. A great portion of my life was plagued with others believing that I'm a nerd, one who lacks in any capability to carry conversations and is inept in any social activity. With this overall perception, people labeled me by my studious behavior and saw me by nothing else." So this is pretty an explicit introduction to the single story. You're just telling me what the single story is. That's a little creative at the beginning with these use of dialogue or conversations here. So that's interesting, but you could try and introduce your complete story or your single story in a more interesting way. So for example, if you look at this one here, it says, "Sitting in the front of the room beneath the teacher's nose, I sat eagerly to learn with the scent of freshly sharpened pencil hovering around my desk. The students behind me sat with an apathetic countenance, twiddling their thumbs, constantly sneaking glances toward the clock. As the teacher quizzed the class, my hand shot up soon after the question rolled off of her tongue. 4 times the square root of 7. But as the teacher confirmed my answer with a nod of approval and turned back to the board, out came a snicker from the back of the room, followed by whispering, 'He can't possibly have any friends. All he does is math.' So you can see in this excerpt, we're actually taken into a moment that shows the single story versus just telling what the single story is. Now remember, the majority of your narrative should focus on your complete story. However, if there's a creative way to also illustrate your single story, you can think about doing that. It shouldn't take up a lot of space. You'll notice this is pretty short. It's just a paragraph, but it's still a more interesting way to let your reader into your single story. Now, we've talked a lot about expository versus narrative genre, and so that's one thing that you want to make sure you're balancing too, right? You want to make sure that you are using narrative to show your complete story and not explaining your complete story to me. You're using expository. So take a second and read these 2 examples. You can pause the screencast and read, and then think about how the first example explains the complete story, while the second example uses narrative to show the complete story. Now, one thing to notice is that the first one, the expository example, is still interesting. It's still well written. It's just not in story format. It's not bringing me into the moment, and that's your goal here, is to bring me into that moment. The other thing that we noticed is the transitions between expository and narrative writing are unclear for many of you. So you want to make sure that your transition between expository and narrative writing is as clear as possible and doesn't confuse your reader. So one thing you want to avoid are cliche openings. So for example, statements that are overly general, like, "Ever since I was young," or "for as long as I can remember." These are very cliche, kind of universal statements that you want to try to avoid in your writing. Oopsies. Okay. You also want to avoid missing or unclear transitions in your writing. So take a second and read this excerpt here, the missing unclear, and then I'll talk a little bit about how that transition is missing and unclear. You might go ahead and pause your screencast at this time. Okay, so if you notice here, we've got this kind of general explanatory paragraph. It says, call it what you will, it's not all that I am. And then we go into dialogue. Oh, you're so cute, can I pick you up? Her towering stature casts a shadow over my diminutive frame. So the transition between this expository paragraph and this narrative moment is just unclear. I don't know who's talking, I'm not really sure what's happening here. There's no lead into the narrative, and that's one thing you want to avoid in your writing. So here's a better example of how you can transition between expository and narrative writing. Take a second to read this, pause your screencast, and notice how the writer transitions into the narrative part. So you can see here, this author says, that is not all that I am. Even my closest friends, however, struggle to look past it. Oh, you're so cute, can I pick you up? This clue here, even my closest friends, alerts the reader that when we go into the narrative moment, this is going to be a close friend. I know who's speaking now. And so it's no longer unclear in the transition between the expository and the narrative writing. So pause your screencast and go back into your own narrative and look at your transitions between expository and narrative. Do you have a clear transition? Is it easy for the reader to follow? Or are you using some cliches? Or is it an unclear transition? Go ahead and fix that now. The next thing I want to talk about is showing and not telling, or using descriptive language, figurative language, whatever you want to call it. So obviously you want to show your reader how you feel, not simply tell him or her. So take a look at these examples here. Go ahead and pause your screencast and read through and note how these examples, the examples in red, tell the reader how you feel, and then the examples in green are showing the reader how you feel. So pause the screencast and read through those. The other thing you want to do is avoid cliches. Now we've talked about this before, but we're going to talk about it again. Go back into your writing and identify any cliches and rewrite them in a more original, surprising, unexpected way. So go ahead and read through these cliches, remind yourself what cliche writing looks like, and then I would like you to pause your screencast, go back into your narrative, and find moments where you are either A, using cliches, or you are showing and not telling, and rewrite those telling moments and use showing moments. Okay, the other thing I want to talk about is dialogue formatting. So when you are using dialogue in your narrative, which I hope that you do, you want to make sure you're formatting it correctly. So one thing to note, and you can see in the example here, that every time a new person speaks in your narrative, you start a new paragraph. Okay, so you can see we've got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 paragraphs here, but most of it's dialogue, right? So your paragraphs will look really, really short, but starting a new paragraph helps your reader follow along with who is speaking. You can see that if it's the same person talking, like here it says, I can't catch the ball, I said over my eyes, waking up, or throw. You don't need to start a new paragraph with or throw because the narrator is still speaking. But then when we have David start to speak again, it says, that's true, you suck. So that's when you want to start a new paragraph. So your dialogue should be formatted, and that any time a new person speaks, you're starting a new paragraph. You can always open up to one of your short stories for further examples of how to format dialogue. Okay? So go ahead and pause the screencast now and go back into your narrative and format all of your dialogue correctly by adding paragraphs when you have new people talking. Okay, so the other thing that you want to make sure you're doing is that your story should be focused on your complete story, not your single story. Okay, so while you may need to briefly explain or describe your single story, the focus of the assignment should be on the complete story through your narrative moment. I'd like you to read back through your story and bold any text that is devoted to telling the complete story. not the single story. And then ask yourself this question: is that the focus of your writing? The majority of your essay should be bolded at that point. If you don't have a lot bolded, then that means you're focusing on your single story and not your complete story, which is not the objective of the assignment. So you're going to want to go back and change that so that you're focusing on your complete story and that you're using your narrative storytelling techniques to show that complete story. All right, so take some time now, go back into your essay. You can go back and look at any part of the screencast, but do some self-editing based on the criteria pointed out in this screencast, thinking about showing versus telling, making sure you're using that descriptive language, formatting your dialogue, transitioning, illustrating the complete story. You may also proofread one of your classmates' stories if you'd like to do that, so that's obviously an option if you choose to do so. Use the rest of the time to edit your document. All right, I can't wait to read your revised stories. I know they're going to be awesome. Have confidence in your writing, and most of all, have fun with your writing. This is your opportunity to really show your reader who you are. So really, really, truly have fun with it. Can't wait to read them, guys.